Good morning. Thanks for joining today's ICCF Group Congressional briefing. We're going to explore the important topic of microgrids today. Congress and the Biden administration have been negotiating the details of an infrastructure plan for much of this year. As recently as yesterday, a group of 10 moderate Senate Democrats and Republicans presented to the White House an agreement on a framework for hard infrastructure, for which President Biden indicated initial support. Though they're far from the finish line and disagreements persist among many of the provisions in the overall price tag, one area that sees considerable bipartisan consensus is a clean energy provision called microgrid technology. Our conversation is part of ICCF Group's Energies and Forests program, through which we convene members of Congress, administration officials, and key stakeholders to explore the areas of bipartisan consensus within conservation and climate policy. ICCF serves as an informal secretariat to the leadership of several influential caucuses here in the US and around the globe, including the International Conservation Caucus in the House and the Senate, and the Senate Climate Solutions Caucus. To learn more, please go to our website, internationalconservation.org. I'm Chrissy Harbin, our Capitol Hill Program Director. I'll provide a brief roadmap for our conversation, and then we'll jump right in. First, we are grateful to be joined live today with Congressman Jimmy Panetta, who represents California's 20th Congressional District in the US House of Representatives. He is a member of the bipartisan House International Conservation Caucus. Second, we're talking with 3 experts who have significant experience in microgrid technology in private industry, government, and the research community. We are delighted to be joined by Katie Herreza, Vice President of Corporate Affairs at the Electric Power Research Institute, Aaron Zamgochian, Director of Strategic Partnerships for ESS Tech, an energy storage company, and Patrick Lee, CEO of PICE, a microgrid control company. Objectives for our conversation include: 1, greater understanding of the topic of microgrids and why they're important. 2, highlighting real-world applications. 3, identifying criteria for project success. 4, discussing what needs to be done for this important technology to advance further. Many thanks to everyone participating today. For those in our virtual audience, please don't hesitate to use the chat box to enter any questions you have during our conversation. We'll draw from these questions during our dialogue. To begin, I'm delighted to introduce our distinguished speaker, Congressman Panetta. Congressman Panetta currently serves on the House Committee on Ways and Means, the House Committee on Agriculture, and the House Committee on Armed Services. So he's certainly in a key position to work on a number of important issues with his colleagues in the House. This past April, Congressman Panetta introduced a bill that advances microgrids, the Microgrid Act. Congressman, many thanks for sharing your time and insights this morning. I invite you to share your perspective on your House-side efforts before asking you a few questions.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I'll just start off with a couple of remarks. Obviously, thank you, Chrissy, for having me today. And obviously, it's great to be here with the House International Conservation Caucus Foundation. I'm glad to be a member of that. Look forward to continuing to our work together. Once again, my name is Jimmy Panetta. I represent the 20th Congressional District on the Central Coast of California. As I like to call it, much to the chagrin of my colleagues, it is the most beautiful district in the nation. I actually introduced myself to my Democratic colleagues that way, and I got a lot of boos and hisses, as you can imagine, that being the brand new freshman member a few years ago. And my response was, well, I guess you've never been to the Central Coast of California, because it's true, because I think if you've been there, you understand why I say that. But obviously, yes, because of its beauty, but also because the people there and people before me, people whose shoulders I stand on, have done a hell of a lot to protect and preserve the natural beauty of that area. We value what we have, and we want to make sure that our future, our children, feel the same way and have this opportunity to be able to say the same thing that I just did to you. Not just that it's home, but that it's the most prettiest home that ever in our nation, I would say in our world. But obviously, you know, we've done a lot to protect it, like I said, from national parks to state parks to a national marine sanctuary to the Monterey Bay National Estuarine Reserve there at Moss Landing. Yet, you know, now what we're seeing, though, is we're having a pretty hard time dealing with these extreme weather events that are coming up that have been, as we all know, have been exacerbated by climate change. And one of the ones we're really dealing with currently is wildfires. I mean, as you'll see, not just on the Central Coast, but throughout the American West, it's no longer a fire season. We have fire years. I mean, we already have a fire going on right now in my district in the Los Padres National Forest called the Willow Fire, and another one broke out in San Benito County. And it's only June, considering how many more months we have left of summer and this heat we're experiencing, the drought we're experiencing at this point. Now, obviously, like I said, this fire and many other fires start on federal forest land that we have. That's why I have introduced legislation to prevent these types of wildfires, to support more ecologically friendly forest management, increase reforestation investment with the Replant Act, and my good friend Senator Rob Portman in the Senate with his sister bill, and to address chronic staffing shortages in federal forests. Now, in the meantime, though, what we're seeing go on is that California takes these pretty extreme steps to cut off power and have these public power safety shutoffs. What that means is that homes and even towns will be cut off from the electrical grid, sometimes hours, sometimes days, if you can imagine that, days at a time. Clearly, that hurts businesses, that hurts people, and that threatens the healthcare and our public safety at times. Now, these power outages, like I said, not just caused by weather events, and not just caused in California, but we're seeing it in places like Texas and even in the Southeast with the extreme weather that's going on. Now, obviously, there's some solutions that we can do, like burying transmission lines, which, as most of us know, can be very, very expensive. And also, we can talk about, proposing tax credits to upgrade our transmission lines. But what we got to realize, though, is that we got to think of other ways that we can do it and basically get off the grid and look at other ways to take advantage of underutilized technology, which make our communities and home more resilient and less reliant on outside energy sources. And obviously, as you mentioned in your introduction and what we're going to be talking about in this, and that's the microgrid. Now, all of you know that microgrids are sort of a group of interconnected loads and distributed energy resources that act as a single controllable entity that can connect and disconnect from the grid. That really enables microgrids to operate in both grid connected or in island modes by themselves. And islanding is really kind of the key here, as you know. When the power goes out, that's when a microgrid can manage and distribute energy sources. And those are often renewable energy sources paired with battery storage and other backup fuel-based generation. It's a cleaner alternative to the diesel backup generators that many people have right now. More importantly, they give communities independence and homes and people independence and ability to take control of their power reliability. That's why in my district, you're seeing microgrids gaining a lot of popularity from homes to entire towns. I mentioned in our meeting that we had yesterday, we have a town called Gonzales. And one time a few years ago, basically the power company cut off its main transition line going into the Salinas Valley where Gonzales is located. Not just hurt that people who live in that town, but businesses that are in that town for 3 days. And so they said, no more. We're going to come up with our own microgrid. They're going to use solar, they're going to use wind, they're going to use battery power. And as you're seeing, not just towns, but also individuals and homes in remote areas in my district, they're all pivoting to microgrids, which is good. But unfortunately, microgrids, as we know, are promising, they're still pretty expensive for a lot of people and a lot of communities. That's why I've introduced the Microgrid Act. That would be a bill that provides a 30% investment tax credit for qualified microgrid policy. And what's going to be great is that municipalities, special districts, nonprofits, and people, they'll be able to take this credit as a direct payment, which is needed because they don't have that tax liability. And that's going to enable a lot of people, our critical infrastructure, a lot of communities and businesses with homes that are connected to the grid, but also be able to operate independently, especially when there are these outages. Now, another area I'm working on, as we talked about yesterday, is innovation in clean energy. That's why I've also introduced legislation for an extension on the investment tax credit and the inclusion of new technologies like linear generators, which are clean and reliable and also can support microgrids. I've also introduced a bipartisan piece of legislation called the Energy Sector Innovation Tax Credit, which will provide next generation technologies that haven't really penetrated the market with enhanced production tax credits. That would include credits for the production of clean hydrogen, which, as we talked about yesterday, are critical to reducing transportation emissions. You know, when having discussions like this and talking about pieces of legislation like that, it really, I'll be honest with you, I feel really lucky to be in this position, that I can actually introduce legislation that can protect us from wildfires, can preserve our environment, can promote resiliency, and also prompt people to pivot to green energy. I'm also lucky, obviously, to have partners like the ICCF, and I look forward to working with you, Chrissy, and with the ICCF so that we can continue to push forward these bills, pass these bills, or any other way in which I can help people that are proud of their homes as I am of mine, be it from the Central Coast to the Central Plains of Africa, continue to perpetuate the future of this planet that all of us call home. So thank you very much, and I appreciate this opportunity to talk about my legislation and what all of us can do when it comes to our microgrids.
Yeah, well, thank you, Congressman. Thank you for your leadership in advancing this legislation that supports investments in microgrids, but also other clean energy provisions as well. It's a really interesting time here as we discuss these clean energy goals, as well as upgrading our nation's infrastructure. So thank you very much for that perspective. I'm curious to know, what would you encourage, since infrastructure is the topic du jour, and a lot of this is playing out in the Senate side. What would you encourage your colleagues across the Capitol, or across from the other side of the Capitol building, and your colleagues here to keep in mind as they're discussing infrastructure, these clean energy provisions, in a bipartisan approach to solving some of these challenges?
Yeah, I think what we're seeing is, you know, when you look at the infrastructure bill, it's kind of the big question has come up of, well, what is infrastructure? Look, and I think, you know, that can range, as we know, from the broadest definition that includes human infrastructure, like investing in and supporting our families in areas like childcare and education, to a narrow definition, that's roads and bridges, or what's simply covered in the Highway Trust Fund. But I would say that we need to look, you know, beyond that, and we need to encourage everybody, our colleagues, our stakeholders, to really kind of not just focus on the definition of infrastructure, but focus on the needs of our country and our communities, like the ones that I just talked about in my brief comments, and what investments we need to make to ensure that it's primed for growth, especially as we recover from this pandemic. We got to look at areas that we've underinvested in, be it transit, be it clean energy, be it rural broadband, our electric grid. And we really got to make whatever investments are needed in order to facilitate the greatest amount of growth, regardless of whether we agree it should be called infrastructure. You know, I really think that we're at an inflection point right now. Mm-hmm. And I think that's how we have to think of this. And for too long, we've underinvested in our infrastructure. Now is the time we need to do it. I read a great article back in 2017, and I keep it around. It's David Brooks wrote this editorial saying, we used to build things. And he said, you know, looking back, and he used the example of the late 1800s, after a massive wildfire we created in the Montana area, we created the U.S. Forest Service. And he says, you know, every generation had their civic institutions that they built. And looking at our generation, we haven't done that recently. Infrastructure investment is something we need to do, and that type of investment that we need to have in looking forward in order to realize that we got to pivot, we got to invest and make sure that we do it, especially ways like green energy and microgrids and greening and decarbonizing our electricity, our electrical sector, as well as our transportation sector. And so, like I said, it's an exciting time. We got to get past these partisan fights and make sure we come together on what's needed for our future. And that's obviously making sure that we invest in our infrastructure.
Well, I want to squeeze in one more question for you while we have you, and it's about a bill that you referenced in your earlier comments, the Replant Act. One that it's a bicameral, bipartisan bill. You introduced it in the House side with Mike Simpson, and on the Senate side, our ICC co-chair Rob Portman and Senator Debbie Stabenow introduced it. Could you share your thoughts for a moment on the importance of forest conservation and how it fits into our broader conversation on climate action?
Yeah, thank you very much. Obviously, just to give you a quick example, when obviously wildfire burns through, especially our national forest land, it gets very hot. And what happens with the land is it really crusts over. And what can happen, as we saw out in Big Sur recently, I don't know if you saw that picture of Highway 1, the famed Highway 1 over the winter that had this huge gaping hole in it. That was right in the middle of the burn scar of what was called the Dolan fire. And what happened is after that fire, we had a lot of rains. And what happened is the rain just flows right off that scarred area, that crusted over area, and flowed down and took out that road. So you not only have fires from the climate change, you then also have flooding that can happen as well, and the damage from both. And so basically we need to work on reforestation and making sure that there are these projects that are invested to reforest after especially wildfires. Now, there's a fund right now to do that. It was created in 1980 to plant trees in national forests, especially after natural disturbances like wildfires. And the fund is replenished, if you can imagine, it's replenished by tariffs collected on wood products, yet it's just capped at 30 million annually. Now, as you can imagine, based on all the wildfires we've had, that is clearly underfunded at this point. My legislation would lift that antiquated cap, basically take it off and allow the Forest Service to plant close to 1.2 billion with the B trees, which would create nearly 49,000 jobs over the next 10 years to address the huge backlog that's obviously there right now because of the amount of wildfires, because of the lack of investment in reforestation projects. So fortunately, with my Replant Act, we'd be able to do that. And I'm so glad that I have partners like Senator Portman and Stabenow and Mike Simpson who are willing to push this forward and hopefully find ways to get it into the upcoming package to do that. Look, I think we know the value of trees and what they can do, especially in our national forest. And especially when it comes to dealing with the effects of climate change. And so we look forward to being a part of it. Like I said, one of the many bills that I get to be proud of introducing and feel lucky to introduce in Congress. We got a lot more work to do in order to get them passed in legislation, but look forward to working with ICCF and our partners here in Congress and our stakeholders to do that.
Well, thank you so much, Congressman, for your leadership and for your time today. Please consider ICCF Group to be partners with you in this important, in addressing these important challenges, and we're grateful for your time today. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Chrissy, and thanks to the ICCF. Look forward to our work together.
Thank you, thank you. So now we go to our expert panel. I introduced Katie with EPRI earlier, and I'm very pleased to introduce our other two panelists. We have Aaron Zamgochian, who is with ESS Tech. It's a very important energy storage company that works with organizations, developers, utilities, and advancing low-cost, long-duration storage. His company is a leading manufacturer of low-cost iron flow batteries for commercial and utility-scale energy storage companies. He's a friend of ICCF Group. He spoke with us earlier on energy storage at a previous briefing. We look forward to hearing from him today. We're also grateful to be joined by Patrick Lee. He's the co-founder and CEO of a microgrid control company called PICE. His company uses real-time data and artificial intelligence to allow modern power grids to autonomously manage a significant level and diverse mix of distributed and renewable energy sources such as wind, solar, and batteries. We heard from Congressman Panetta on a lot of important applications, including hardening the grid, resiliency. We'll also hear about some other newer commercial uses for this stuff as well. So Katie, Aaron, Patrick, thank you very much for joining us. Microgrid technology is such a dynamic issue. We're eager to hear your perspectives. Before we dive into Q&A, I'd love to get your initial reactions. Who would like to go first? Aaron, would you like to kick it off? Sure. And then we'll hear from Katie and Patrick?
Sure. Well, first, Chrissy, thank you for your leadership. Thank you for bringing everyone together. And, something that Congressman Panetta said really resonated, I think, with all of us here. We used to build things here. And that's one of the critical aspects of what we do at ESS Tech Inc. We actually build these safe, non-flammable, non-toxic, environmentally friendly, long-duration energy storage platforms right here in the United States of America, and we're growing. We certainly support the Congressman's efforts to put forward an investment tax credit for microgrids, and we also count on his support for an investment tax credit for energy storage as a standalone asset with added preference for those technologies that are actually manufactured right here in the United States, because it's so critical as we look at further deployment of microgrids, not just from a resiliency standpoint, but from a national security standpoint as well. And I think we're really fortunate to have Katie with us, because I know that she's an expert on that topic and can speak at length about the critical national security importance of microgrids.
I fully agree. I think Katie really straddles the intersection between government and research. So Katie, would love to hear your insights here before we move over to Patrick.
Sure, thanks. Yes, and I'd also like to thank you, Chrissy, for inviting me here today. I'm really excited to join this terrific panel on such an important subject. And so, yes, I spent some time with the U.S. Department of Energy on infrastructure development. I was in the permitting space, and so we were trying to shorten those environmental assessments, do them well, but still be able to bring forth more infrastructure development. And in the microgrid area, we definitely see where there's it's a complicated, you have it, as the Congressman said, it's a lot of loads and different kinds of resources being controlled as a single unit. And it crosses jurisdictional boundaries and has different ownership. So there's a lot of different perspectives that need to work together. So collaboration is absolutely essential. And that's one of the things that EPRI really tries to do. Is we're an independent nonprofit that works with government, utilities, or third parties, or the vendors, communities in particular, to bring these people to bring everyone together so that we can come to the common goal of trying to find the most benefits from a microgrid, particularly from a national security standpoint. I'd say microgrids probably started off, I was involved in a SPIDERS program way back when, maybe about a decade ago, where we try to prove out those technologies in the military space. And so how are military bases? It's part of a defense in depth approach. So can you have one, can you disconnect from the grid if you need to? Another one is just to be able to reroute the grid in different ways so that you can avert whatever the attacker might be putting underway. So it's definitely an exciting time to be working with microgrids today, because I've seen tremendous advancements to get to where we have more control, more visibility in order to be successful in advancing microgrids today.
Thank you. I find it fascinating to learn about all the different applications and the national security importance, as well as the clean energy provisions. I want to dive into that, but first let's hear from Patrick. He's led a lot of innovative work in this space, and I would love to hear his initial reactions as well.
Yes, Chrissy, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak. I think as the Congressman talked about the definition of microgrid, I think he had it right on. It's really about a group of mixed assets that we can actually control and manage our profile of the energy. He touched on, I would say, three key areas of the application of microgrid. One is for resiliency, and the other is to be more energy independent. I think we translate that into most customers that we help with, look at how they can reduce their energy bill by using the energy mix, in a most effective way. And lastly, I think that's the part that I think many of the national research talks about, a network of microgrid. Because when you look at each one of these microgrid as an entity, they can be mostly self-sufficient, but also have the ability to help other microgrids. So I think that energy sharing across microgrid is really what's producing the lower cost, getting higher return on our infrastructure. So I think those are very important area of full understanding of what microgrid means.
Absolutely, thank you. So Patrick, you're the CEO of a microgrid control company, and Aram, you're a leader with an energy storage company. Could you both talk about how the important roles of your respective companies and how you work together in advancing this technology?
Sure. And let's talk about a real world example, Patrick, where we're already working together with our friends and partners at PICE. The Congressman referenced the public safety power shutoffs, which are unfortunately a regular occurrence in the state of California these days. As a result, regulators have now mandated microgrids and similar solutions to be aggressively rolled out to minimize those public safety power shutoff events. As a result of that, and to mitigate those effects, both ESS Tech Inc. and PICE are working together on a microgrid project in Southern California for a major US utility where our long duration batteries are going to be integrated with PV and PICE's controls platform for multi-day continuity of services to not only first responders, but also critical customer loads like hospitals, cooling centers, education facilities, et cetera. I think most importantly, though, it's not just about public safety. The project makes good economic sense because for 6 months out of the year, when we're not in wildfire season and not dealing with public safety power shutoffs, the battery is going to be dispatched along with the PICE controls for multiple applications around the year, therefore increasing the bankability of this important project in Southern California.
Yeah, so yeah, to add to that, when we look at microgrids, there are different components in the microgrid, as Aram has talked about. So in order to orchestrate, to combine these technologies together, you have to look at how to piece them together in a planning of early on. Excuse me. Sorry about that. So as I talked about the three components, having the energy resources, having good energy storage, and then having a control system to be able to coordinate them together is very important. So we need to bring partners together early on in terms of planning, because as a provider of a microgrid controller, we have to orchestrate the different pieces, equipment to be able to work together. And so it takes a lot more planning than most people think, because sometimes people go with the wrong sequence, right? They select the component first before they select the control system. So I think we need to, maybe think clearly on when we piece together microgrid, how to make the plan in a way early on.
Thank you for that. It's great to know how you're working together. And about some of these important use cases, especially for different purposes. Can we talk about the current state of microgrid technology? I'm curious to hear about this group's thoughts on recent advancements and where it can go in the future. Katie, would you like to start with this question? I feel like you have strong insight here.
Sure, thanks. So I think with the current state of microgrid, it's really exciting to see. There's so much buzz around electric vehicles, right? The electric vehicle infrastructure. So how are we going to get there? And so fleet electrification and charging infrastructure are extremely complex. So Patrick was right on, like you've got to really plan. And so in order to meet the needs of this explosion of electric vehicles, which we anticipate, we've got to really carefully consider the planning and operations. And so one of the projects that we recently announced is working with some startup companies where there's promising advancements in software to help optimize the microgrids and the various loads and interconnections and how it operates with the grid when connected and when not, and how we can do this in a more affordable, reliable, and accessible way for those in that area. And earlier, I think I had mentioned about the transportable designs. I think that's very exciting because when we were thinking about emergency situations, and sometimes you need something that's more mobile. So can you take some a microgrid that is ready to go in an emergency situation to an area in need. That I think that's an area that we'll see great advancements in.
Great, thank you. We had a question submitted by one of our listeners, Terry Hill. It's on this point. It's, in the case of California and the wildfires, does this panel see a role for city block scale distributed microgrid topology combined with REACH building standards? I'll throw it out to the group.
That's a tough one, but it's a really good question. And, again, I'll just refer back to, the project that we're currently working on with our partners at PICE, and how it relates to, I think, the critical need for microgrids as a resiliency mechanism. I mean, there've been a significant number of grid connected microgrids deployed everywhere from universities, hospitals, fire stations, commercial and industrial sites. But increasingly, we're seeing utilities are using microgrids for a wide variety of use cases. Primarily resiliency. They've got sustainability goal attainment targets, but also grid services, depending on the incentives or the regulatory jurisdiction. So this is where I think, Congressman Panetta's investment tax credit for microgrids comes into play. Senator Wyden's commitment to an investment tax credit for energy storage as a standalone asset. So, again, as you unlock these multiple value streams and they're realized, particularly when you scale and couple with long duration energy storage systems, I think you really see both the resiliency and commercial value of microgrids. Thank
you. So what are some of the important elements and key components that make a microgrid project successful? I'm wondering if there are ways to measure the success here, or what this group's thoughts are. Patrick, do you have a perspective on this, on measurement?
Yeah, I think oftentimes we only look at the resiliency part of the microgrid. I think we really have to pay more attention to the other parts. I think, we talk about the three key application of benefits of microgrid. Because if you think of the resiliency part on, well, how often does a fire or how often does a storm, it's a small percentage of the time of the year. So we really have to look at 99% of the time of the year, how do we use the microgrid to provide lower energy costs, and also look at how do we use microgrid to help other microgrid in terms of interdependency, so that we don't have to install as much infrastructure, right? But I do think that we do need a lot of infrastructure first, right? But then when we do it wisely, not everyone has to be totally independent. Otherwise, it wouldn't be cost effective. If everyone's islanded, there's no need for a grid, right? Then a lot of the resources are locked up inside the microgrid.
Katie, Aram, any thoughts on this, on measurements before we move to some other thoughts?
Sure. I think about, there's important factors like flexibility, available backup power, and ability to island. There's smoothing out supply for demand spikes. Those are some of the functions that microgrids can offer, but they lead to improved outcomes. And as Patrick said, yes, resilience, but if you can also help with a demand response, or looking at how it's another option to help with getting the most that you possibly can out of the microgrid itself, and also if it's connected to the grid, being able to interconnect when necessary. So it definitely helps to make it more robust, but also offers more services than before.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. I think the important aspect, and Patrick, touched on this, are the grid services and the ancillary services to the grid that microgrids that are connected to the broader grid can actually provide. And I think that's something that we need to take into account.
Absolutely. No, I think that's a very important point. So in the time that we have left, I would love to hear, we've talked about this throughout this conversation, but what this important technology needs to go further. Congressman Panetta, of course, talked about his important legislation. Aram, you've referenced a lot of this in your comments as well. I think about the wind and solar industries, which have benefited for the past few decades with the wind production tax credit and the solar investment tax credit. Could I get this group's thoughts on what incentives may be needed to expand and deploy microgrids at the local level in the future, and any other additional closing thoughts that you have? Katie, would you like to share your perspective first, and then we'll hear from Patrick and then Aram?
Sure, happy to. So at EPRI, we look more at the technology space. So I think what I was going to offer is that a lot of times, and I mentioned this earlier, we both had talked about grid services, meaning the grid is being used to help the whole grid. And something that would help advance things a bit more would be to shift the conversation to the magnitude of these services. It's not just about whether or not they can provide them, but how much can they provide, which is much more than we have imagined.
Very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, so, I really think it always needs a balance of policy and technology and market adoption to really move and accelerate a market. So I think, having, these, kind of policy and also the incentive support certainly move the technology in terms of lowering costs and also helping the economic adoption. So I think if we carefully look at how we balance that and making sure we remove roadblock for application, because today, as Aram talked about, there are a lot of application behind the meter, but there's also a lot of application ahead of the meter at the utility space. So we need to make sure, like the Congressman called on, everybody needs to be, helping to put these infrastructure in, right? We shouldn't restrict anyone because of some historical policy or something like that. So I think we need to be much more wide open in terms of thinking on how do we get more of them into implementation.
Yeah, and just to echo that, amplify that, as important as yesterday's bipartisan framework announcement is on the investment side, the spend side, at least from our perspective, we firmly believe that as we emerge from this pandemic and we want to, promote Buy American and Hire American, we really need targeted investment tax credits that support American-made long-duration energy storage. That will help with adoption of the technology, as Patrick referenced. It'll help shore up our domestic supply chain, create jobs, and it'll demonstrate that we can compete, not just domestically, but globally as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, I regret that we don't have more time, because I would love to really explore the competitiveness issue. I know that that's certainly something that affects the clean energy industry, many other really important industries, and the U.S. has certainly led on that topic. Well, thank you very much. We have to wrap our conversation here. I realize that we've only scratched the surface. There's so much to talk here. So if folks who are listening have any questions that they have unanswered, or if they want to ask our panelists questions in the future, don't hesitate to reach out to me. I'm happy to build connections. Thanks to everyone for tuning in today. Thank you to Congressman Panetta for his comments at the start of our program and for his leadership in Congress on advancing microgrid technology and many other important issues. Also, many thanks to our expert panelists, Katie, Aram, Patrick, for being so generous with your time and insights. I've learned a lot from our conversations, and I hope that and I trust that our audience did as well. We'll continue our ongoing conversation on bipartisan energy and forestry solutions next month. We're going to convene a similar conversation, this time focused on electric vehicles. featuring remarks by the Norwegian climate minister, a research expert from Argonne National Labs, and a panel discussion of industry experts. So that should be a good conversation as well. So please don't hesitate to reach out to ICCF in the meantime. We're at internationalconservation.org. Thanks very much, everyone. Have a
Thank
good
you,
day.
Chrissy, as always.
Thank you.